Thank you so much for inviting me here, Ariel. I cannot imagine a better poem to listen to on this anniversary. I'm a community organizer who ended up coming into technology in my 20s at a time when community and technology was kind of really quite a new field. And I was at Google for almost 8 years. I'm proud of a lot of the work that I did there, but certainly in the last couple of years, 2017, 2018, I began to ask myself harder questions about the company. It was the time of the Maven organizing efforts, which I was involved in Europe. And for me, because I was working, first of all, in engineering, and second of all, building spaces for entrepreneurs around the world, I began to observe in the founder communities that I was part of, which were, everywhere from kind of Warsaw to Seoul to Stockholm to Karachi. I began to observe this decline in real time of the Silicon Valley narrative. For anyone who came into tech at a certain era, the same era that I did in the noughties, there was this very growth at all costs, blitz scaling. That was the narrative that we were given. That was the playbook that we were told was right. And I just kept thinking there has to be a better way. When we talk about ethics, I believe this is a practice and a process. There is obviously no silver bullet to achieve this goal. It's obviously a practice that we carry with us every day, reiterating our values, making tweaks, trying our best. And with Midjar, we've been working in the space of better technology for the last 15 years. Pierre and Midjar founded eBay and sold it. And we've been impact investors since the kind of early noughties, funding for-profit and non-profit companies in spaces like civic tech, education, financial inclusion. And I think after the first Trump election, there was this moment of reckoning that said, investing is not enough at all. If you really want to kind of push for social change, you have to also be thinking about policy. You have to be thinking about coalition building. And so in my day job, a lot of the work that my team does is pushing for technology that is equitable as well as innovative. And so what my co-lead owns is the policy work, which is fantastic, but of course is not my specialism. So much of that is around how do we check the power of the largest companies of our time through smart regulation? And I think this is, antitrust last year was obviously a lot of gates open last year for the first time around antitrust that I think we're seeing opening now around how we think about harms to children online. Regulation alone isn't enough, but for me, it's a very important part of the puzzle. And I think another part of the puzzle is how do we build up the technology we want to see in the world? I think it's so tempting. You mentioned this earlier, Mia, but it's so tempting to anchor on the largest companies of our time. But that's not where products begin and end. That's not where culture begins and ends. And so much of the work that my team does in my day job is really around, we do everything from for-profit investing to grant making to coalition building to kind of help push the leaders and organizations doing incredible work forwards and help them do more. And for me, in terms of angel investing, it partly came about because I just have a very strong belief, every action you take is a vote for the world you want to see. Investing is captured by such a particular audience. It tends to skew very wealthy, very male, very profits only. And I've been working with founders for years, navigating these really hard questions around how should we think about governance? How do we balance the need to grow with the wanting to grow well? These are just questions that had come up in my circles for years. And I'd kind of coached founders, or at least helped them ask themselves questions for a long time. And eventually it kind of got to the point where I had a little bit of spare money because the work I was doing, I'd been kind of giving to charities. And I kept thinking, well, okay, could I take part in this? If I put $5,000 into this company, what would that mean? And so I funded now about 25 companies of all different types and styles. I think two things I've observed. One is that out of those 25 companies, only 3 are cisgender white men. Like I just naturally tend to prefer to work with founders that can be underestimated by the market and have a very different view of the world. And secondly, for the most part, these companies are anchored in community solutions and worker power are my 2 favorite areas. They're just areas I have a strong passion for. But really, when we talk about AI ethics and the future of technology, to me, it's critically important that I keep working with very early companies. I have a very strong belief that you make choices in the first year of building a company that, can take you down all kinds of paths. And I really want to help founders work out what the right path for them is. I do not always know the right answer. I don't believe anybody does. But if I can be a voice in that room, helping them navigate their first year, I would love to help them in that. So that's kind of how I came to the space.
That's fantastic. You have such a great background, and it just seems like such a great transition into this broader world of investing in more ethical technology. So speaking of investment strategies, and you alluded to it, because the money seems to, I did my own research. So I was looking at who's investing first in the tech companies. We already know that. That's we all, it's a public, not a secret. But when we look at responsible AI, ethical AI, we're looking at the organizations which are even within that space who are being funded. They also tend to be mostly white male. So we're seeing a mirroring. There's a tech industry, there's the ethical, responsible tech industry. The difference I see is between coded bias, which is Joy Buolamwini, centered around a woman of color, and then you have social dilemma, which is centered around experiences of white male. So from an investment strategy, like how do you counter that? Like contrasting your individual role as an angel investor versus Omidyar network. Like, do you use targeted investments, or do you, like, are there any investment strategies that you adopt to make sure it's going to the right, to the underrepresented groups?
Well, and I think it's worth noting, you know, with Omidyar, because for-profit investing is one of the tools we have. We always think about it in terms of tools. We're very different from a classic VC, where their only duty really is pleasing their LPs. And I think this is the thing that is, you know, when we're looking at the unevenness of the market and the missed opportunities that are out there, I think there's a couple of blockers. I think one is that, you know, raising money does not mean the company is, you know, when we talk about value, so often we come back to capital, right? So often we come back to money raised. And I just want to push back on that notion. I think, you know, constantly we see stupid companies raise $50 million. It shouldn't be so, but it happens. And I think, you know, particularly looking at the kind of responsible AI space, there is incredible commercial opportunity coming out of the last couple of years. If you look at like GDPR, CCPA, there are, you know, compliance alone means that finally we're seeing companies going in the space, VCs building up in the space. That it's kind of the field of privacy, which as a European has been I wouldn't even call it a trend. It's just something that we essentially believe in. That I think we're learning now that Americans really believe in too. It has been going for a long time. But, you know, if we think about how most people that have the financial freedom to leave their job and start a company tend to be white men. Most people that are able to get through the hurdles to become a VC, which is an incredibly complicated thing to do, tend to be white men. You know, I do not believe the venture capital is the right path for every single company. You know, so many of the companies that I funded, both at Omidyar and in my personal capacity, they just don't want the strings that come with VC. I think VC is great for certain kinds of companies when there is a very particular growth track in mind. But I would argue that that growth track often gets in the way of behaving wisely and well. So, you know, we funded Zebras Unite through my day job at Omidyar, who are an incredible community of entrepreneurs who are, you know, really working to build incredible sustainable companies. They believe that unicorns, you know, the idea of a company worth over $1 billion, unicorns aren't real. Zebras, who are black and white, they make money and do good at the same time, are real. And there are so many more zebras out there than unicorns. I think it goes back to so often our imagination is dimmed by what we see in front of us. You know, the press around technology tends to be very binary. It tends to either be the very important surfacing of harms or the kind of mad blahs raised 100 million. And, you know, I think we see this with Basecamp. I've been quite fascinated in the last year by kind of the you know, we funded a lot around the rise of tech worker power, the interesting cultural shifts happening in the last year, where I think, you know, bosses are not reading the moment. I think workers are realizing the incredible power they have and demanding the working environments they deserve. But, you know, there are very few stories that we see publicly of people, you know, working to, you know, when we talk about the practice and process of baking ethics into companies, of how we operationalize this work, we don't really see enough stories of what that looks like. And I think that's why this community is so powerful, is we're able to learn from our peers exactly how they went about assessing something, exactly how they went about deciding to do something or not do something. And it's those stories I want to read about. I don't want to read a story about blah, smashed $100 million in funding. I do want to read about the harms, but I also want to read a couple of these green shoot stories that tell me about possibilities. Like, how do we do this work better? how do we resist a lot of the pitfalls of the conventional industry that have got in the way of great companies since time began, or, you know, all badly intentioned companies too?
Great points,
Emilia,
Laura.
you're muted.
Love your perspective. This is very refreshing because you don't get that a lot of times when you are talked to an all white male panel, right? This is why we need more women like yourself in these positions, because you see the opportunity. And I like your approach where you say it shouldn't be about just 10x growth, because I feel like that is what might also be destroying innovation. So fun fact, my first job in Silicon Valley was at eBay. And this was at a time when eBay was the big kahuna. Facebook was a new kid on the block. So much has changed since then. Yeah. So one of the advantages that organizations like companies say, we look at WeWork or Uber, or all these massive companies, right, who were supposed to have 10x potential, they don't actually make any money. So it's like, it's refreshing to see, going back to the basics, hey, can you actually make money? And the 10x goal seems nice, it sounds great, but how many actually would have fulfilled that without getting some obscene amount of VC money? And I often think about, what if that had been shifted to so many women-run organizations or ventures, because they would have maximized like the potential of those ideas and do it in an ethical way. So my experience from there, that shouldn't be this trade-off. Like, you can either be ethical or you can make money. I feel like your approach is more.
I mean, I think it's something I learned. So having recently moved back to London from Silicon Valley, I've always had, like, I keep thinking about this, like there's something to me about American exceptionalism and like bigger is better, bigger car, bigger house, etc. And somebody taught me last year that the origins, you know, the word scale, when we talk about scale, that word came from when the plantations in the Caribbean were being exported to the US. So many of the nasty ideas in capitalism and in society and culture go back to slavery. So I think, I think, you know, as a community person, as a community organizer, I know that when you build a community over a certain size, things do break, because it's very hard to maintain the original feel of the first group. And I think what you're talking about is, you know, my preference would always be, when you're building a company, to kind of build something that really serves the need of a particular person or a particular group or a particular society. But there are companies that I work with now, you know, one company that just wrote a blog post about this, where amazing female founders building something, they're building a thing library. So the idea is that, you know, they want to make borrowing as good as buying. So when you're redoing your garden or doing DIY, you know, they have software and they have physical locations, and it's going pretty well. They just did a deal with IKEA to kind of be in various IKEAs around the UK. And they're making money. They're making a couple of $100,000 a year, which keeps them going. But whenever they speak to conventional funders, it's not big enough, despite the fact that it's making money, despite the fact there's an incredible social purpose behind it of, you know, people live in small houses, we all have too much stuff, we have too much debt. You know, what tends to happen is the terms of the market are set by a very particular, you know, VC has a very particular viewpoint on what makes a company worthwhile. And I think for us as technologists, we have to actively resist that definition. And so much of what I'm seeing is large companies kind of a library of things, that last company. And they are British. Sorry, I have a couple of British examples. I have some American ones too. I think for those of us who are technologists, we have to actively resist a lot of the definitions that we've been served up, because they're not serving us anymore. You know, I think when we talk about 10x growth, when we talk about 100x growth, how can that possibly be? All of us look at our bank accounts and we know that can't be. We know that that's not how the market works. We know it's an illusion. So when we see these stories, we have to ask ourselves, what are the labor practices? You know, you look at a company like Amazon, what are the labor practices this company rests on? Who are the stores that are being decimated because of these practices? I strongly believe it is not possible to get to that kind of scale without doing some pretty nasty things. And I think we're still seeing, you know, what does it mean to do our best in building a company? And I think we have some examples of companies that are showing their homework, building in public. You know, I think for all that they're a big company, I do think Salesforce are sort of doing some great work in this area, and they've staffed up their team appropriately and well. You know, you have Mozilla on next, who I always think of as an example of a company who lead with their values. But, you know, I don't think we should expect these companies built on new kinds of principles to be the scale of the old kind. And that's the trouble, right? Is when we have 50 examples, I want to see 50 examples of companies trying their best, that make money, that have founders that look very different to what we've come to expect. And I would love to see groups like these nudge more founders into being, because I think I'm lucky in that I have the companies I meet tend to be wildly diverse just because of the network that I built around me. But I think every day I get an email from a white male investor friend saying, I have not met a female founder or a founder of color or a trans founder in the last month. And I just think, my God, we live in bubbles.
Yeah, denial can be very blissful, I've heard. So it is such a challenge, and I love how you lay that out. And there is something about when you are, the incentive structure, it's so harmful, right? Just pushing people. And like you said, it is not possible to achieve that level of scale. And we are seeing that. The companies, even with this atrocious practices, are being propped up on one hand, and the others, like Amazon, are squeezing the workers. And AI is especially a conversation needs to be had, because if we talk about AI doing all this great work, but if it's just replacing the folks who are already being abused and exploited, like it even takes away their power. So later today, we'll be talking more about policy. You mentioned antitrust, you mentioned regulation, and how do communities come together to organize against some of these issues, better labor practices. So throughout the day, we will be talking to more individuals, organizations who are pulling together that ethical vision and showcasing that in the product. So you're right, we have Mozilla, we have DuckDuckGo later today, we also have folks from ACLU, Access Now. They're all coming together pretty much to lay out that vision. Can you talk to us about, you mentioned some British companies, but there are also, you have some bigger investments too, right? Big names like Partnership on AI, Illuminate. I'm also reading about smaller projects like Logic School. Can you talk to us about like what is the strategy or thinking behind these investments and what we can expect from that?
Yeah, and I should note, we're in the middle of a kind of refresh of our work right now. So if I look backwards, everything makes sense looking backwards, but perhaps it didn't at the time. So I think a couple of investments I would pull out for this particular community. One that I'm really proud of, that I think Kathy Pham might be mentioning later, Responsible CS. So for me, I've got 2 English degrees. So God knows how I ended up managing engineers. But something that was really interesting for me when I began working with engineers is, as part of my undergraduate education, I learned to criticize, I learned to pick things apart, all the things that I think a good humanities education gives you. And, when we realized that many conventional CS courses were just pure code, that you were judged by hours of code done, kind of going into roles, we thought, okay, this is a really interesting opportunity to kind of help young kind of minds be activated to other ways of thinking. So Responsible CS was co-funded by us, as well as Craig Newmark, Schmidt Futures, and Mozilla, housed at Mozilla, and really worked to bring 17 different US universities together to kind of work out, how would you bake ethics into your undergraduate CS education? I'm super proud of this program. I think firstly, because the community of academics behind it are amazing. Cassie Fiegler on TikTok alone, what a star. And the approaches they've taken are very different to each other. You have these really amazing multidisciplinary teams kind of working to kind of build what works for their community. And they released a playbook recently that I'm gonna find you and put in the chat later. But it really is inspiring for any academic institution that wants to help their students kind of reimagine. I think that's an example of something that we thought was worth kind of large scale investment. I think with Logic School, they are, I don't know if any of your attendees get Logic magazine, but it's this incredible quarterly that really critiques technology in like an incredibly smart way. So they've had these themes like the commons, kids, military. Many of their writers are people like Sophia Noble or Astra Taylor. They kind of blend the kind of various communities, from kind of academics to activists to technologists. And we work with them to kind of understand, okay, for tech workers that are kind of asking themselves questions, for everybody on this call, I'm guessing they're specialists, but for many of your colleagues, the product managers, designers, marketeers, they have questions that are not always, I think there's often this supposition in tech that, ethics is this person's job, it's this team's job, which I believe is totally false. Like, obviously you have specialists who have a specialism in a particular area, but I think at the same time, responsibility is a collective commitment that we make, right? And with Logic School, this is an evening class they've just wrapped up along the theme of creative protest. So they brought together 40 tech workers of all types, and over the course of the lessons kind of really worked to help them come together, ask questions, brainstorm together. I'm going to their graduating class in 2 nights' time, where everyone's presenting a project they've worked on, inspired by a lot of Everest Pipkin's work, who I'm a massive fan of. And I think with Logic School, for us, it was really a test about building community, which is why I love this particular group. I think there's an incredible need in tech for community. For me, having come in from journalism in my 20s, it was really surprising to me that there weren't, all the community, all the institutions. It was mediated through universities. I didn't go to university for a tech subject, so I was cut out of that, or your organization, or the company you work for. And particularly given the hours that big tech workers work and the campus culture, it can be complicated. There really isn't always space to kind of ask questions, find your people, imagine what's next. And having built community spaces for a lot of my life, I just powerfully believe in the need to ask questions in a group setting, and brainstorm and come to conclusions and work out where you went right and work out where you could go wrong. I think so many of the problems that we've seen in technology in the last 10 years come from a lack of asking those questions and a lack of the right people in the room where those questions are being asked. I have firsthand experience of that from my time in product teams. It can be it certainly to me at the time felt incredibly hard to raise my hand constantly as the least technical person in the room, as the only woman in the room, let alone the fact that all of us in the room were white. I think there are so many things I look back on and think, okay, we are constantly learning more about groups that are locked out. We are constantly learning more about practices that we should move on from. And I think sometimes the only way you come to these conclusions is in a group setting.
I couldn't agree more. It's well said, which is the purpose and mission why Women in AI Ethics exist. So one of the feedback we constantly get is last year during the pandemic, we instituted a mentoring program. And we have a very tiny team. It was a huge undertaking for us, but we were able to get around 150 participants from 30 countries. And one thing that came out of it is this need to belong, have someone mentor them, guide them. And it's so important because a lot of us feel isolated in our workplaces. We don't have the kind of support system that we need, especially if you're a woman in a very heavily male-dominated space, or also as a woman of color and so on. So what you said is absolutely resonates, and that's pretty much the reason that's true for us. And so just taking a quick break for folks who are just joining us, we do have Sarah Drinkwater, Head of Beneficial Tech at Omidyar Network. She's also an angel investor, and we are just asking her about and getting her insights on how do we investment strategies for more ethical and diverse future. So we will be taking questions, if it's okay with you, Sarah. There was a question that came through, or we can hold that towards the end. You mentioned, let's see, there was one question about how can we get smaller companies to prioritize, slightly tangential, but we talk about big tech driving this conversation around ethical technology. Just was curious if you had any thoughts on. Is there how do we also?
Oh, sorry. It's funny. I think I can think of so many examples of smaller companies that do not intend to become big companies that are doing their thing really well. I think it's more that it takes active work to resist the growth impulse. Like everyone else assumes that's what a company is, that you get big. Everyone else assumes that you add people, that you add money, that you add this, that you add that. There is this assumption around progression that I just don't think has to be the case. And I think we funded last year and co-created a toolkit called Ethical Explorer that is ethicalexplorer.org. It's free. And the reason we built this is we kept hearing from very small teams, under 10 people or under 5 people, that were like, okay, we can't afford a consultant. We can't afford to build our own in-house team. how should we navigate these questions around outsized power, bias in AI, questions that I think are incredibly complicated, but actually not at the same time, if that makes sense. If you have your values and your mission set, I would argue that that's a way into them. So this was, we went out looking for something to fund. We didn't find it. We found loads of incredible, more sophisticated resources that work once you've had some kind of initial onboarding into this field. But there really wasn't something that was like super digestible, like a layperson's terms kind of version of this. So basically the format is a pack of playing cards, 8 topics. We worked with specialists and academics to kind of basically digest really complicated themes into 300 words, which is quite a complicated thing to do. Trying to put why monopolies are often not good into 300 words. So the idea is that, we gave in the toolkit a bunch of ways that you could use it on your own, that you could use it as co-founders, that a team could use it, that you could use it to kind of at an offsite to reflect on your next phase of growth or to look back and see where you've done well. And the idea is that you're able to ask yourself questions and have an open conversation with your team around what's appropriate to you. So the kit helps you assess where you are now and assess where you want to go. It's now been downloaded something mad like 30,000 times. And what's been interesting is it's been downloaded by many very small teams, but also a lot of people in big tech, a lot of academics, a lot of activists. I think we wanted this tool to be free. There's a blank card that comes with it for you to put on. Like, I'm confident there are many topics that we haven't thought of that are pressing for companies to think about. And it's been very interesting hearing how companies have used it, because nearly all the people that have got back to us and said, this is what we used it for, are small teams. I think partly because they don't have the lawyers saying, you can't talk about that externally. So, I think for smaller teams, I think there are plenty of good examples of companies out there doing the work. It's just they're not getting the kind of visibility. If you look at the work that Salesforce does, they have the ability to garner the sort of press, and that's useful because then, these visible examples help inspire smaller companies. They help show that there are other pathways to kind of growing and doing your thing. But I think what's interesting about this phase of technology, and I think of it very much as a phase, I think this is how all tech will shift, but it will take us time, is that the companies that we will love in the future will not look like the companies in the past. You look at the Ubers and the WeWorks, both of which are really interesting. Like, we look at like the very obvious cultural awfulness that happen at both companies, and yet I still use Uber occasionally. I feel terrible about it when I do it, but there is no other taxi company in London. So it's like, WeWork I don't use. But, it's there's a sense of capture there for us as consumers that I think we need to navigate around. Using different and better technology will involve a certain kind of friction. Companies like Mozilla and DuckDuckGo make it easy for us. And I think in time, there will be products that fulfill every need that we have outside of the largest companies of our time.
Amen. This is exactly, just a heads up, I'm having some technical issues, so I may, so you might have a breakup and technology is great until it stops working. But very simply put, the reason today we don't have big tech presence today at this event is showcasing that there are alternatives. And like you mentioned, all the groups, Mozilla, DuckDuckGo has figured out how to create a profitable model, very privacy centric. So inspiring people is important. Having the right investors is important. Having the right mentors is important. Like you laid out, guidance is important. But it's also important to look at make it easy for people to be ethical, because I really feel like what gets lost in the academic discussions is we are not connecting the dots between here's a great idea. This is how you should be ethical. Here's an expert on or ethicist. How do we take it to real world? How do we? So I like that. One thing we will be doing, we are introducing a directory of all the tools that are being shared today, in addition to other tools. So folks can just go in and find those tools and the frameworks that they need, because to your point, not everyone has a team of lawyers. Not everyone has developers or communities who can, like an army of folks who can create these toolkits. So the easier we make it is better. So speaking of small companies, so we talk about investments. So let's talk about, you mentioned Basecamp, small company, they got into trouble from diversity issues, right? So one, it reflects when a culture is so white male dominated, how they look at ethics. Sure, they have a great work ethic, they're big supporters of remote work, but when it comes to supporting their workforce, which it isn't white male or has different experiences, they struggle. So I know you were very vocal about it.
Well,
like,
okay, so I think,
you want to share some perspective?
Yeah, and I think Basecamp is a really fascinating example of how influence does not always correlate to size. Basecamp is a 60-person company. It's a 60-person software house. And the reason why I felt so strongly about it,
I think half
it's,
of them left.
yeah,
Sorry,
well,
it was, I think, about 1/3.
Yeah, and I think they captured, certainly for me, I've been reading their books for like maybe 10 years. And this goes back to the problem that you mentioned earlier around coded bias versus social dilemma. Like, who do we put on pedestals? And I would argue that we should know enough by this point to stop putting people on pedestals, or at least to kind of raise everybody up on a pedestal. I think with Basecamp, what they got in trouble for was going public with an incredibly bad-tempered blog post telling their employees that they can't discuss social and political issues at work. Now, if you're trans, is your right to exist a social and political issue? Like, can you not be at work? I think it's incredibly naive to assume, like, product is policy, right? The product that the company that I build is a living example of what I believe in. How the product looks, who it centers, what kind of employees I hire. All of these are ways of seeing publicly what a company truly values. And so many of the people that went to Basecamp were attracted by the leadership position they'd assumed around good working culture, remote work, et cetera, et cetera. So then to hear the founders miss the moment so badly and assume completely incorrectly, I believe, that social and political issues have no place at work, when I would argue that everything is political, everything is social. I think, they basically burnt their reputation in a week. And knowing a couple of the people that left quite well, people were rightly extremely hurt. And many of the people that stayed because they financially cannot afford to leave right away. So I think this is something we need to bear in mind, is we're in this incredible moment where my theory is that a lot of people didn't move roles last year. There'll be a lot of role moving this year. And the best talent will go to places where they feel safe. For all of the people on this call, the talents that you have are in high demand right now. You have the ability to set your terms. For the most part, you have the ability to kind of ask hard questions. And I think that's an ability that we should all use as much as we can. I think with any leader right now of a team within a company or a company itself, this is a moment of incredible collective trauma. We've lived through multiple crises. Today, we have the anniversary of this awful murder that spurred this global movement where, there is no conclusion or end in sight, right? We seek justice, and we've had moments of that, but it's a very long process, right? And I think it's exhausting. We are all exhausted. And I think leaders that don't understand that and don't create space to talk about things that are not the product in hand, this notion of productivity that I actively want to resist against. I think to be a leader at this moment in time means listening, asking questions, evolving, learning. I just think to not have your ears open at this exact moment in history strikes me as an incredible failure on Basecamp's CEO's part, and co-CEOs, I should say. And I think it's an example for all of us of, great culture is a practice. It's not a destination, same as ethics. It's something that you have to keep working at and working at and working at. There will be failures along the way. It has to be highly intentional and co-created. It cannot, you can't tell a team the culture is this. It doesn't work like that. Everyone should be participating together,
Agreed. I think there is something to be said about this denial, the general denial that there is a direct correlation between diversity on your teams versus how it comes out in your outcomes. We've seen it with Timnit Gebru, we've seen it in Google, and we've seen headlines. We've seen them all. We've seen all the technologies that are coming out with bias, and they have so many unethical issues, but you can trace it back to management. Whether it's, like you said, whether it's a big tech, whether it's a small tech, the lack of diversity will show up eventually in the products that you're building. So having the diversity, and also what you said about options, that's so critical, because when you don't have options, you can't just walk away, which is why the reason we wanted to bring you today to our event is looking at, I think of it as a strategy. That's your exit strategy, that if this doesn't work out, you have a way to walk out and say, okay, I'll find an investor, I'll find an employee who values me for what I bring to the table, and I can bring my whole self.
Yeah.
So one of the questions we are asking all of our organizers, all the speakers is, do you have any opportunities? Are you looking to hire? Are you looking to invest, and so on? So we can give folks those opportunities.
Yes and yes.
So I have a question around that.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
That was just a hearty, like I'm always open to, I mean, as an angel investor, I always look at companies. In my day job, I love meeting interesting people. I love connecting people. If I can help, I would love to.
Thank you. You're amazing. I do firmly believe that you're one of those people who walks the walk, not just talks the talk, and you actually proactively help, from my own experience. So I appreciate that. Okay, so what we can do, there are a couple of things. I did have a couple more questions for you, but there are some questions also in Q&A. Just so folks know, we will also have Sarah on Twitter. I'm assuming, Sarah, 15 minutes after this on Twitter, after we end. Okay, so folks, we will have Sarah on Twitter as well, because we want to encourage you to connect with her and also our other speakers so you can continue the conversation. So as soon as this session ends, and we have another 15 minutes, and we will move this to Twitter, where we will continue the conversation. So let's see if there are questions. There are two questions which are interesting. One is programmers create for ethics. You mentioned how it shouldn't be one person's responsibility. How do you feel about a programmer's creed?
Look, I'm a proud funder of Ethical Source, which this person may know. Coraline Emke's effort to kind of shift culture change in the open source community, which, you know, I think for anyone who's worked at a B2C company, the engineering team tends to be the power base. You know, these are the people that can build the product. And I think, you know, there's been some really interesting, like I funded in my first year at Omidyar a kind of data scientist pledge that at the time wasn't successful, but I believe that we made mistakes. I think there's going to be, I feel so strongly that we'll see change at the worker level. I think big bosses, capitalism, they're not going to shift. The incentives are not aligned. I think what we'll see happening is you've got activist investors making things happen at shareholder meetings. You've got policy coming top down. You've got workers protesting. You've got workers leaving. I think there are so many ways for an individual and the communities they're in to kind of make their presence felt, to kind of be clear about their boundaries. But I'm always curious about power and privilege. You know, for me, as a white lady, I have a duty of care to kind of speak up for those who do not have access to the rooms that I do. I have a duty of care to use my money wisely and to kind of invest in people that do not look like me. But, you know, that's a privilege. And I think certainly for those who are younger than me, who have less funding than me, speaking up is a hard thing to do. You know, we see this with whistleblowers. They kind of go into the wilderness for a bit. And I wish that were not so. We're funding some resources to help them kind of navigate that process. But I love that. And I think we need all kinds of mechanisms, institutions, communities to bring people together to take collective decisions that say, okay, this is not okay, and we're not going to work on it. You know, you saw like No Tech for ICE, Stanford Liberation Movement. There are all of these kind of interesting No Tech for Tyrants, all these things that are kind of happening. I think this movement is absolutely undeniable.
Love it. Thank you. I actually penned an article for Fast Company about, it was specifically about Google, but it applies to many of these organizations. It's the time, the moment in time right now, where there's, we talk about levers. What are the different levers that we can use to shift to a more ethical world and more diverse world? Is, you mentioned antitrust, you mentioned worker organizing, workers speaking up, the more power. And there is power in a community, because individually you may not feel empowered to do that, but with more whistleblower protections and more regulation, we can empower them to do that. So thank you. It just, like, every conversation we have reinforces that optimism. So we did have one question, I believe.
And I want to plus one on what Ranjit is saying. You know, white fragility very much expresses itself in many other bodies apart from older white men as well. I just want to plus one on that, because I think so often when I think about bad leadership, I have a particular image in my mind of what that looks like, and I need to keep critiquing that. I
hear you. Okay. So Nalini had a question about, tech investments for teams that are investigating problems versus typical tech setups that are trying to solve for something or to build something?
Yeah, it's interesting because I would find
investigating problems.
Yeah, I would find, having built companies before, that great companies tend to be curious. That's just my bias. Like, so for example, they want to solve a particular problem and they're not set on how they will get there. They don't, they're flexible but focused. So say Organize, a company that I funded, they're basically a worker voice platform. And what they care about is how do they help workers, exactly to this conversation, collectively have a voice. And they have built a software platform that helps them do that. Very unusually, they've got VC funding to do so, like a light amount. But I think great teams, for me, will always be curious. They will always have an awareness of the society they live in. So say, for example, I would never want to fund the 17th dark kitchen bringing delivery food to my house. It's just not interesting. It's the same companies that we've seen before using the same playbook. And I think it really goes back to, like, venture capital likes to tell you, the story it tells us is these are the cool free thinkers, but that's not true. These are money men. These are money-making middlemen. And that's why I'm so fascinated by how VC are the cool kids these days, because that was never the case when I first kind of began in this field. They were like the drones. I think if you take the risk of starting a company, which is a pretty massive risk, I don't see why you would not do that unless you really believed in this thing you were trying to solve for. And I would love to see more people who do not look like the traditional founders take that leap. And pursue their conviction, pursue their guts, because I'm confident we would see a better raft of companies.
That's my hope as well. The challenge is the people who don't look like them also face the greatest number of headwinds. So they don't have the tailwind that a white cis male would have, say, a woman of color. So which is why these conversations are important, and the levers that you mentioned is important, because even if you want to follow your conviction, you also need a community behind you, whether it's investors, mentors, or folks or regulators who are behind you to help support you and get you there. Yes. So let's see. We will. I did have a question about the levers. I'll just go through. I have a question about atomic. Yeah. Oh, that the one? Is that you? Are you still currently with Atomico? I just want to make sure that.
Yeah, so this is basically an angel program where 12 of us have been given some funds from this company to kind of invest in companies as we see fit. So again, I'm pursuing my thesis, community solutions, worker power. That's just the area that I'm most passionate about. And I think what's been interesting is, for me, being part of a program with 11 other investors, I get to infect them with what I care about, in the same way that I get to learn what they care about. And what's interesting is so many of the group just had not considered the politics of their work before. So I always think about my mission when I'm in those kind of rooms. How do I speak on behalf of those who aren't in the group? How do I infiltrate them with what I care about? How do I get my position across? And I can see there are more questions in the chat. I know we have to wrap up in a moment. But my Twitter is Sarah Drinkwater. My email is sdrinkwater@omidyar.com, OMIDYAR. Oh, thank you, Ray. Oh, thank you. You've done it for me. Amazing. I'm just gonna put my email in the chat. But I would love to catch up with you on Twitter. And if anybody in the group is working on something really exciting, I would love to hear from you.
Thank you. There was one question which it's outside of the realm of, it's also from Ranjit, but it's outside of the realm of investment strategies and startups. But I'll let you decide if you have anything to add here. It's really the difference between the definition of ethics versus the metrics of outcomes. Do you have anything that you'd like to
I mean, it's such an interesting question, because I would argue, when we talk about ethics, I know that has a very particular definition based on a practice that's been around for thousands of years, but I always think about it in terms of integrity. How does a company do what feels right to it? And, you could think about that in terms of sustainability. You could think about that in terms of inclusivity. You could think, there are so many lenses you could use to kind of look at that. And I would argue that's why it needs to be collectively determined by all the workers of a company, because they're the ones that keep the company to the promise it's made. But really often it comes from the top, right? If the founder thinks sustainability isn't important, it will never be on the roadmap. And for you joining a company, if you don't see that on the OKRs, it's not a priority. And I've made this mistake in the past of joining a company and believing I can persuade them something is important, but if it's not in their top 5, it's not going to get on there. But I think when we think about outcomes, I would always go back to, I believe that integrity has to be tied to the mission of the company. So if your company is a thing library, then you have to, a core goal might be number of things loaned this year, but it also might be the authenticity of how that how the new, sorry, that's my toddler who's home from nursery bashing the door behind me. Him and the mouse are hanging out, I believe. It's also about how well can they kind of roll out this and make it feel part of the community. Are they hiring the right people? Are their team happy? Have they stuck to their mission? If they're doing a deal with a larger organization, is it the right deal? Will they stick to their principles? I think when we think about OKRs, a challenge that we always have is that we judge ourselves on 3 monthly cycles. And in reality, if you make a misstep in this 3-month cycle, the consequences can be quite long-term. So I always think about short-term and long-term thinking. But I love that question. I don't have a good enough answer for it. I would love to. I will continue to puzzle on that one.
Okay, we are out of time. I just had one last question in closing. Do you have a favorite book, author, or writing that you would suggest this audience read?
Yeah.
Or
sorry, I love an English writer called Deborah Levy. She writes about women and freedom. She has a new book out called Real Estate, which for those of us who love to relax by looking at pictures of houses that we can't afford, is an excellent read about what freedom means to those of us that haven't always had freedom in the past.